On January 10, 2000, two men stood before the world and announced what they called a historic merger for the internet century. Steve Case, CEO of America Online, and Gerald Levin, CEO of Time Warner, smiled for the cameras as they revealed a deal valued at $350 billion, the largest merger in corporate history. The stock market exploded with excitement. AOL's market value hit $165 billion. Media analysts called it brilliant. Investment banks celebrated. Everyone agreed. This was the future of media. 2 years later, the combined company reported a loss of $99 billion, the largest corporate loss in American history. Steve Case would be forced out in disgrace. Gerald Levin would resign, admitting catastrophic failure. Ted Turner, who lost $8 billion of his personal fortune, would call it the biggest mistake of my career. And over $200 billion in shareholder value would simply evaporate. How did Steve Case convince one of America's most powerful media empires to hand him control? How did two CEOs destroy $200 billion while claiming to create the future? And what warning signs did everyone miss while they slept through one of history's greatest corporate disasters? This is that story. If you're fascinated by the economic stories, everyone slept through the massive deals, the billion-dollar mistakes, the moments that changed business forever, please hit that like button and subscribe to The Sleeping Economist. Click the notification bell because we're uncovering the financial history they never taught you in school. Chapter 1. When dial-up was king. To understand how Steve Case pulled off history's worst merger, you need to understand just how powerful AOL seemed in 1999. America Online wasn't just an internet company. It was the internet for most Americans. If you wanted to get online in the 1990s, you probably heard those famous words. You've got mail. AOL had 27 million subscribers paying monthly fees. That's 27 million people handing over $20 to $25 every single month for internet access. The company was printing money, $4.8 billion in revenue in 1999, with profit margins that made Wall Street salivate. Steve Case had built AOL from nothing. A former pizza marketing executive, Case recognized early that most Americans didn't want complicated internet access. They wanted it simple. AOL gave them that: a CD in the mail, easy installation, a friendly interface. By 2000, more than half of all American homes getting internet access did so through AOL. But here's what made Case truly dangerous. He understood something about the stock market that Gerald Levin didn't. In early 2000, during the peak of the dot-com bubble, internet companies were valued at absolutely insane levels. AOL's stock price had nothing to do with its actual business. It was pure speculation. Case knew this. He knew AOL was wildly overvalued. Meanwhile, across the corporate landscape, Gerald Levin ran Time Warner, a real media empire. Time Warner owned CNN, HBO, Warner Brothers, Studios, Time Magazine, Sports Illustrated, and vast cable networks reaching millions of homes. This wasn't speculation. These were actual assets generating actual profits. Time Warner's 1999 revenue was $26.8 billion, nearly 6 times larger than AOL's. But here's the problem. Wall Street didn't care about old media. Time Warner stock was reasonably priced, even undervalued. They made movies, magazines, and cable TV boring. AOL represented the future. Exciting. Levin was 60 years old. He'd spent his career building Time Warner through mergers and acquisitions. He desperately wanted to be seen as a visionary, not as old media's dinosaur. He worried Time Warner would be left behind in the digital revolution. This fear, this desperate need to appear innovative, would cost him everything. When Steve Case approached Gerald Levin about a merger of equals in 1999, he wasn't proposing a merger at all. He was proposing the greatest stock swap heist in corporate history. AOL would use its insanely overvalued stock Case knew was worthless at those prices to buy Time Warner's very real assets. The victim was being set up, and Gerald Levin never saw it coming. Chapter 2. The deal everyone celebrated. The negotiations happened in secret throughout late 1999. Steve Case worked carefully, flattering Gerald Levin, promising him the CEO role in the combined company, painting visions of a merged future where Time Warner's content would flow through AOL's internet pipes to millions of subscribers. The math seemed to favor AOL. Using their stock price, AOL would acquire Time Warner for approximately $165 billion. The structure was presented as a merger of equals, both companies contributing roughly 50% to the new entity. But the reality told a different story. AOL shareholders would own 55% of the combined company. AOL executives, led by Steve Case as chairman, would control the board. Bob Pittman, AOL's aggressive president, would become co-chief operating officer. Time Warner was the larger company by revenue, by assets, by employees, by every measure, except the one that mattered in January 2000, stock price. Gerald Levin convinced himself this made sense. He told Time Warner's board that combining with AOL would give them internet distribution for their content. Magazines could go digital. HBO could stream online. Warner Bros. Could deliver movies over the internet. It was the future. Ted Turner, Time Warner's largest individual shareholder after its previous merger with his Turner Broadcasting, had serious doubts. He'd already seen his company swallowed once. Now they'd be swallowed again? But Levin assured him. The board assured him. The deal was presented as inevitable: get on board or get left behind. On January 10, 2000, they announced it to the world. The media reaction was euphoric. The New York Times called it a deal that will reshape the landscape of media and the online world. Business Week declared it the deal of the century. The stock market initially celebrated. Politicians praised it as American innovation. Everyone agreed. This was the future of media converging with the future of the internet. But some people noticed warning signs. AOL's revenue growth was already slowing. Their subscriber additions were declining. Broadband internet cable and DSL was beginning to replace dial-up, threatening AOL's entire business model. Some analysts quietly questioned whether AOL's stock price made any sense. More concerning, AOL's advertising revenue was suspicious. The company was booking complicated barter deals as revenue trading advertising for other services, inflating their numbers. The SEC would later investigate these practices. But in January 2000, during the peak of the dot-com bubble, questioning internet stocks made you sound like a dinosaur. Gerald Levin and Time Warner's board voted to approve the merger. The deal closed on January 11, 2001. AOL Time Warner was born. The combined company's market capitalization was $350 billion. Within months, it would all begin to unravel. Chapter 3. When the bubble burst, the dot-com bubble didn't burst on a specific day. It deflated slowly, then catastrophically. By March 2000, just 2 months after the merger announcement, the Nasdaq began collapsing. Technology stocks that had been valued at 100 times earnings suddenly dropped 50%, then 70%, then 90%. Hundreds of internet companies that had seemed invincible went bankrupt. The speculation that had made AOL's stock price possible evaporated. But the AOL Time Warner merger was already locked in. The deal closed in January 2001, just as the full extent of the disaster became clear. Immediately, the culture clash began. AOL executives, who'd spent years in a fast-moving internet startup, collided with Time Warner executives who'd built their careers in traditional media. Bob Pittman and other AOL leaders started making demands integrate faster, change systems, adopt AOL's methods. Time Warner executives quickly realized they'd been had. AOL wasn't the future. It was a dial-up internet service provider watching its business model die as broadband took over. Worse, they discovered AOL's advertising revenue had been significantly inflated through accounting tricks. The SEC launched investigations. By mid-2001, AOL's subscriber growth stopped completely. Then it reversed. People were canceling their AOL subscriptions in massive numbers as they switched to broadband. The revenue that had justified AOL's stock price simply wasn't there. Gerald Levin began to understand he'd traded Time Warner's real assets for AOL's worthless stock at the absolute peak of the bubble. But by then, the damage was done. The September 11th attacks accelerated the advertising collapse. Companies slashed budgets. AOL's advertising revenue, already suspicious, collapsed entirely. The integration between AOL and Time Warner, the entire justification for the merger, wasn't working. Time Warner's content didn't need AOL's distribution. Consumers were finding HBO and CNN and Warner Brothers content through their cable providers and increasingly through broadband internet that had nothing to do with AOL. In January 2002, exactly 1 year after the merger closed, AOL Time Warner announced its quarterly earnings. The company reported a loss of $99 billion, the largest corporate loss in American history. Let that number sink in. $99 billion. Gone. Destroyed. Vaporized. That single quarterly loss was larger than the entire GDP of most countries. Steve Case's position as chairman became untenable. Gerald Levin announced his resignation. Effective in May 2002, Bob Pittman was forced out. The board began discussing removing AOL from the company name. And Ted Turner, who'd watched $8 billion of his personal fortune disappear, began telling anyone who would listen, "The AOL merger was the biggest mistake of my career. The worst merger in history was complete." Chapter 4. Who lost? Let's talk about the human cost of Steve Case's disaster. Ted Turner lost $8 billion personally. He'd been worth approximately $10 billion before the merger, mostly in Time Warner stock. After the merger, he held AOL Time Warner stock instead. When that stock collapsed from $90 per share to under $10, Turner's fortune evaporated. He would later say he contemplated suicide during this period. The man who'd built CNN, who'd revolutionized television, was financially and emotionally destroyed by the merger he'd opposed. But Turner wasn't alone. Regular Time Warner shareholders saw their investments destroyed. If you owned Time Warner stock before the merger, you received Time Warner stock in the exchange. That stock would lose 85% of its value over the next 2 years. The math is staggering. At the peak, AOL Time Warner was worth $350 billion. By 2002, the market cap had fallen to approximately $70 billion. That's $280 billion in market value destroyed, but the actual wealth destruction was even worse. Time Warner shareholders lost approximately $200 billion in value, the difference between what their real media company was worth and what they received in the merger versus what AOL's worthless stock ended up being worth. This was the greatest destruction of shareholder wealth from a single corporate decision in American history. AOL's original shareholders actually made out okay. They'd exchanged their overvalued stock for real Time Warner assets at the peak of the bubble. Steve Case himself remained extremely wealthy. But the Time Warner shareholders, the victims of Case's scheme, were devastated. Employees suffered too. AOL Time Warner laid off thousands of workers as the integration failed. People who'd built careers at respected companies like CNN and Time magazine found themselves working for a failing conglomerate. The cultural damage was immense. Time Warner had been one of America's most respected media companies. After the merger disaster, it became a corporate punchline. Gerald Levin went from respected CEO to cautionary tale. His legacy, decades of successful deal-making, was permanently destroyed. The SEC and other regulators investigated AOL's accounting practices, particularly around advertising revenue recognition. The company eventually paid substantial fines and restated its earnings, admitting it had overstated revenue by hundreds of millions of dollars during the period leading up to the merger. In 2003, the company officially dropped AOL from its name, becoming simply Time Warner once again. But the damage was permanent. In 2009, Time Warner spun off AOL completely, essentially admitting the entire merger had been a waste. AOL became an independent company again, worth approximately $2.5 billion, a tiny fraction of its $165 billion peak valuation. The company that destroyed $200 billion ended up worth less than a cheap startup. Chapter 5. How it changed corporate America. The AOL Time Warner disaster didn't just destroy one company. It changed how corporate America thinks about mergers forever. First, it killed the idea of synergy as justification for deals. Before AOL Time Warner, executives could announce mergers by promising synergies, vague benefits from combining companies. AOL and Time Warner promised unlimited synergies, content plus distribution, old media plus new media, traditional plus innovative. None of it materialized. After the disaster, boards and shareholders became dramatically more skeptical of merger synergies. Show us the actual numbers. Prove the integration will work. Don't just promise the future. Second, it exposed the danger of stock-based deals during market bubbles. Steve Case used AOL's overvalued stock as currency to buy Time Warner's real assets. Gerald Levin accepted that currency, not understanding that stock prices during bubbles bear no relationship to actual value. After 2002, corporate boards became much more careful about accepting stock in mergers. Independent valuations became mandatory. Boards started insisting on fairness opinions from multiple investment banks. The idea that you could trade overvalued stock for undervalued assets became much harder. Third, it destroyed the cult of the visionary CEO. Gerald Levin had been praised as a visionary for doing the merger. Business magazines celebrated his boldness. In corporate America during the late 1990s, being called visionary was the highest compliment. After the merger collapsed, visionary became an insult. Boards learned that CEOs who want to be seen as visionary often make catastrophically bad decisions. The steady, boring CEO who focuses on actual business fundamentals became more valued than the exciting CEO promising transformation. Fourth, the disaster helped end the dot-com bubble psychology. AOL Time Warner's collapse was so spectacular, so complete, that it forced Wall Street to reconsider how it valued internet companies. If the biggest, most successful internet company could be worth essentially nothing, maybe all those valuations were wrong. The subsequent crash and corporate governance reforms, Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002 can be traced partly to lessons from the AOL disaster. Time Warner itself eventually recovered. After spinning off AOL, Time Warner rebuilt as a traditional media company. In 2018, AT&T acquired Time Warner for $85 billion, then later spun it off again. Today, Warner Brothers. Discovery continues the legacy of the original Time Warner properties. But AOL? By 2015, Verizon acquired AOL for $4.4 billion less than 3% of its peak valuation. Today, AOL exists mostly as a legacy email service. The company that once dominated the internet became a cautionary tale. Steve Case remains wealthy and active in investment circles. Gerald Levin lives in California, rarely speaking publicly about his career. Ted Turner recovered some wealth, but never forgot what the merger cost him. The disaster that everyone slept through changed business forever. Chapter 6. What we learn from $200 billion. So what do we learn from watching Steve Case destroy $200 billion of shareholder wealth in history's worst merger? First, hubris in mergers destroys value. Gerald Levin's desperate need to be seen as innovative, to prove Time Warner wasn't old media, blinded him to obvious risks. He accepted a deal that made no strategic sense because he wanted to be celebrated as visionary. The moment executives start caring more about their legacy than about actual business logic, disasters happen. Second, stock price doesn't equal value. AOL's stock price in 2000 had nothing to do with AOL's actual business. It reflected market speculation during a bubble. But Gerald Levin treated that stock price as real, accepting it as currency for Time Warner's actual assets. Never confuse market price with intrinsic value, especially during obvious bubbles. Third, merger of equals is always a lie. When executives announce a merger of equals, someone is lying. Every merger has a buyer and a seller, a winner and a loser. AOL acquired Time Warner using overvalued stock, giving AOL executives control despite being the smaller company. Time Warner shareholders were the victims. Always look beyond the PR to see who actually ends up in control. Fourth, cultural integration matters more than strategy. Even if AOL's business model had survived, the merger would have failed because the cultures were incompatible. AOL's aggressive startup culture clashed with Time Warner's traditional media culture. They spoke different languages, had different values, couldn't work together. No amount of synergy overcomes fundamental cultural incompatibility. Fifth, watch the warning signs. AOL's subscriber growth was slowing. Broadband was replacing dial-up. AOL's advertising revenue was suspicious. All the warning signs were visible in early 2000, but everyone ignored them because the stock market said internet companies always go up. When a deal seems too good to be true, it probably is. Sixth, complexity hides problems. The AOL Time Warner merger was incredibly complex, multiple divisions, complicated integration plans, synergies that required 10 years to materialize. When deals get complex, executives can hide problems behind the complexity. The best deals are simple and obvious. The AOL Time Warner disaster reminds us that even the smartest people make catastrophically bad decisions when they let ego, fear, and market euphoria override common sense. Steve Case knew AOL was overvalued and used that knowledge to take control of a real media empire. Gerald Levin knew Time Warner was solid, but traded it for internet hype. Both men destroyed the wealth of millions of shareholders who trusted them. Today, when you see news of massive mergers, remember this story. Ask, who really benefits? What's the actual strategy? Are we in a bubble? Is this visionary or just reckless? Because the next disaster won't look exactly like AOL Time Warner, but the warning signs will be the same. And once again, most people will sleep through them. If stories like this, where we uncover the economic events that shaped our world while most people weren't paying attention, fascinate you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, because we're just getting started with these financial educational mysteries.